So, Devaraj Sandberg, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Great to meet you. Great to meet you, James. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, we're going to be discussing bioenergetics, Reich, Lowen, bodywork, character structure, all these things around bioenergetics. And you've written a fair few books on bioenergetics now. You run one of the sort of in the one of the, I guess, the few sort of bioenergetic training and facilitating schools, we could say, which is certified. And so you're one of the experts these days. So Devaraj, I mean, yeah, tell us about yourself and what your journey has been to get to the point where bioenergetics seems to be your focus over, say, other modes and methods of healing.
Well, I'm 64 years old. I was born in the early 60s, and I came from kind of like a high trauma background, like psychology people would kind of think of. Left by my original parents, adopted. Quite a lot of intense stuff going on in the adoptive family, and I kind of, by the time I was about 18, I escaped to London, as you do, get out and go to the big city. And then quite quickly dropped out of society. I had a job for a little bit, then kind of dropped out. I was like a hippie for a while, but I was too angry to be a hippie, so I became a punk. So I was a punk through the sort of early 80s and stuff like that. And then kind of getting too much into boozing and alcohol, living in squats for about 8 years in Camden and the West End, and generally being in kind of subculture, drifting into crime and stuff like that. And I think in my late 30s, kind of around the late 90s, it became somewhere increasingly clear to me, even though I was, using alcohol and drugs a lot, that I needed to change my life. And if I didn't do it soon, I was going to end up in dead or in a mess or in prison and stuff like that. And then 1999 was like a kind of changeover year for me. I took a drug called ibogaine, which is a kind of shamanic healing substance from Africa, 4 times. Once in the Cameroon. I got arrested and, threatened with a massive prison sentence, which kind of really reinforced to me that this wasn't a good direction I was going in. And I started doing therapy, basically. I thought, well, I need to do therapy. I was like 38, 39. So I was kind of looking around for therapy and stuff in London, and I came across this place, the Open Centre. I maybe still there. It's in Old Street. And I started going to some workshops there with a guy called Guy Gladstone, who was a good guy. And we do these he would do some body work, and then you'd kind of sit around talking like groups of 10 people, and he'd hold the space. It was kind of good stuff. But I kind of, after about a few months, I felt like, well, I'm picking up some new friends that aren't just raging druggies or crims and that kind of thing. But it's not really, I need something much stronger to get into me. I was quite motivated at the time to want change. And so I started casting around again for different things. And at the time, the Osho scene, coming from the Bhagwan, was still quite strong in London, even though he died about a decade before. And there's a lot of these guys, they're called sannyasins around Muswell Hill. And I started to go to those guys and see what they were doing, dynamic meditation and this thing called the Om meditation, which sounds very sort of meditative, but it's actually a lot of being in a room with a load of people screaming at them and stuff like that. And all these quite intense group therapy practices. And it was just straight away obvious to me that this was what I needed. It was like one of those situations where something just really is obviously clicking for me, and so I just really jumped into that whole scene. I left Soho and just lived in a flat in a different part of London. A couple of years later, I moved into an Osho community in Dorset. And then I was attending a lot of workshops at an Osho center in Holland for a long time and doing therapist training there, though not with the intention of being a therapist, more with like the intention of just getting my life less of a mess, basically. But and at some point I just stuck with that, and then I was getting feedback to become a therapist. So I thought, like, the only other thing I'd really trained at was being an electrician and in construction. I did it, and that was good money and stuff, and the times when I was doing it, but I didn't want to be old and just still being a sparky. So I thought, a therapist is, even though my I had chronic low self-esteem. I just thought, well, I'm getting told by people that I should be a therapist, therefore I'll just go for it. So I guess that's like early 2000s. And then from there, I just kind of continued along, initially using the same kind of very intense group therapy style that I'd learned from the center where I trained, and then just giving it a more meditative twist, instead of being so full on, and at some point, I mean, I was leading a lot of emotional expression workshops where you're kind of screaming and shouting a lot. And as I started to come out of the Osho community, and I was living in Brighton, and I realized that you can't really do this. One, it's not so popular anymore. The younger generations now, I sound super old saying that, they don't really want to make so much noise. It's more safety focused, compared to like the kind of people around 20, 30 years ago. And also, it's just hard to find a place where you can just make a massive racket, in a urban situation. People call the cops, so it's like, because I'd done quite a lot of bioenergetics when I was training in the center in Holland, I just thought, let's do bio, and literally looked on YouTube to expand my practice. I thought there's bound to be a load of teachers on there. There was a guy called Elliot Hulse, who I know a bit, who's a famous kind of YouTube strongman from South Florida, a very popular guy. But he was putting out bioenergetics, but in a kind of a bit of a random context. He wasn't a therapist. And so I just thought, well, there's a bit of a gap here. And I started a YouTube channel on bio, and that expanded into breath work and other body-based therapy practices. And I was running workshops, and that's really where that's really how I got into this scene. Essentially, I didn't come from like training at Reich school or training at Lowen school or anything like that. It was more just coming out of my own need to change, really.
Do you feel you've had a pretty drastic character change? Because I'm a bit not to stereotype people. Look, you mentioned, that you're a criminal, you were at some point or adjacent to this kind of that's that form of character, and I will say now that that's all very surprising to me. Nothing about your character or presence seems to equate to that. So it seems you've gone through a fairly drastic character change, over these years.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's a funny sort of term, I guess, character change, because you've got to think called character structure, but mostly people are just going to say, has your personality really changed? And I don't know that what happens is, I guess, by doing this kind of screaming and shouting and bioenergetics, some of the kind of charge in my system came out. And it enabled me to understand more what was going on in my life, why I got into crime, because I'd had a very bad relationship with authority growing up. I hadn't had any positive experience with authority. And so in my own mind, I was on a kind of payback trip, and it just seemed totally valid to be a crim, and when some of that charge came out, I could understand some of the dynamics, but were leading me on. So it was for me like a path of deepening self-awareness, in the sense of, okay, I'm understanding more of what's motivating my behavior, especially the bits that I think are a bit dodgy. I don't know that I undergo a huge personality change. It's more like the layers of the onion thing, kind of thing. And I felt like I had more fluidity after a while. Whereas before, maybe with low self-esteem, I would never have considered doing something posh or chasing after a very attractive woman or whatever, but things like that became more legitimate to me. They became more possibilities.
Have there been any really, I mean, you don't have to divulge if it's very personal, but were there any, sort of really key moments of bioenergetic catharsis for you, where you can think back and think, this specific exercise or this specific workshop really let something go?
I can still remember the first time when I was doing very intense group therapy, these kind of 5-day workshops where you never sleep and stuff in Holland. When I was on that, when I could actually allow another man to sort of hold me and let me cry. Before that, there was no way I would go there. And that was a bit of a pivotal thing. I think at times I really felt like something moved in my belly or something like that, like I went through phases when I would feel absolutely suffused with the worst negativity imaginable, but could just somehow keep going, and and just a lot of stuff like that. Really, I guess my journey was more just keep going, just keep going kind of thing, and it'll get better.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've noted down this idea of layers, which I actually kind of want to get back to, but we're tiptoeing around the word. I mean, what is bioenergetics? I mean, what is it generally, and what is it for you?
Well, I guess, I mean, the story that Alexander Lowen was an American, I believe, therapist who trained with Wilhelm Reich. In fact, he became a doctor so he could train with Reich. And then when he started out on his own, he wanted a term for what he was doing, which I think was a bit more vertical in the sense of stand up rather than standing up, rather than kind of being on the couch, which a lot of Reich's work was more one-to-one stuff like that. And he came across the term bioenergetics and he called it that. But to me, there may be more to it than that. And it's not in some ways a perfect term because there's also some kind of field of biochemistry or something that's called bioenergetics, which often confuses people when they look for the term Google searching, like a totally different thing. But, I think the term's quite catchy in a way. And that's as much, I mean, the Lowen Institute might be able to give you a lot more info, but that's what I understand. To me, it's more like using a term that's kind of known. I don't think there's any kind of good definition for it.
Hmm.
I would distinguish it from, say, breath work, where you're doing there's lots of different types of breath work and you can distinguish it from them. I guess to me, it's more about mostly stand-up exercises where, like with a classic kind of bioenergetic static stretch, you're basically stretching your body in a certain way and then you're breathing and feeling your body, so you're putting certain muscle groups under like kind of controlled intelligent stress, and then you're kind of ventilating, not necessarily over ventilating, but breathing quite deeply to bring holding patterns and stuff, dead zones to the surface so that some release can take place. There's also dynamic postures where there's inherent movement in them, which are possibly a little more cathartic, but that I think the classic bioenergetic kind of posture, that's what it's doing. You're putting your body in this weird position and you breathe and feel.
And the purpose, I mean, you mentioned there holding patterns and dead zones. So do you see the purpose of all of this kind of alike right with armoring is, unlike talk therapy, which is healing via trying to get to the mental root, where the purpose of bioenergetics is to heal via holding. I mean, do you mean by holding patterns and dead zones, do you mean armoring, or do you see a little difference there?
Well, just to expand on the whole thing, first of all, just like both Reich and Lowen would integrate like this body work kind of practices with regular psychotherapy, talking therapy, talking about your relationship with your mum, authority, whatever, but you don't have to in therapy necessarily go through the thinking mind. You don't have to, because trauma conditioning, which tends to be a bigger thing in my experience, is held in the body, in that the muscles acquire characteristic shapes. Ideally muscles should be kind of toned, not super floppy, but not super tense all the time, somewhere in between. But our muscles and our body fascia, which is like the interconnecting tissue inside the body, tend to hold the past, and so in a sense, it's the kind of substrate of the personality, the substrate of the thinking mind. And there is the option to just go direct into it. Traditional psychotherapy goes in through the thinking mind. You talk about your life with the therapist. Maybe you have insights. Maybe you access deep emotions that are held inside of you, but it's done through the mind. You're using this middleman, basically. But there is the option to just go straight into the body, to just put the body in under stress, breathe and feel, and see if you can get straight into the thing. With armoring, that's really holding patterns, essentially. I would say there's two classic ways that the body holds the past, but the muscles and the fascia. One is this kind of idea of holding patterns, which are like overly kind of tense muscles, which don't, relax afterwards. They remain in this kind of held position. That's how I would see it. And then the opposite end of the spectrum is like, so you've got like toning the ideal, and then you've got over tense, or you've got over relaxed, where almost the consciousness, the awareness has dropped out of the muscle or dropped out of the fascia. and that's more like someone who's just not present in a way. And in a sense, those are the two kind of primate responses to threat. If you're like, imagine yourself as some kind of little rabbit or something like that, and you hear a kind of sound, or you think a predator's coming, you can tense yourself massively and get ready to sort of leg it real fast, or you can kind of play dead. You can just kind of try and fade into the background and hope that you don't present any kind of threat or excitement to the predator, and it just kind of keeps going. So those are two kind of classic responses that I think primates have, playing dead, just collapsing, like a muscle just collapsing, like it's almost not there anymore, or getting super tense and ready to just go on the attack, or run very quickly. So that's kind of how I see holding patterns, dead zones in the body. Yeah.
Hmm. And do you, I mean, as a practitioner, maybe this is helpful for listeners who haven't sort of undertaken this kind of work. It, what what is the feeling like when that's being released?
Well, the thing is, I mean, it would be great to sort of say that it feels great or something, but I mean, often you don't necessarily notice, it's like, for sure, I run a Telegram group which is sort of available on my YouTube channel, and there's just like 200 people describing always their experiences with these things and stuff like that. And like, sometimes, yes, there's a lot of physical shaking or contractions going on in the body. Sometimes there's a huge welt of emotion coming up. Sometimes someone who's maybe been a bit of a pleaser is suddenly just finds themselves enraged later in the day at a queue in the post office or something like that. Um, it's very hard to kind of specify. There's a therapy that's similar to bioenergetics called trauma release exercises, coming from the States, and it's a bit more coherently packaged. It's like a subset of bioenergetic exercises, in my opinion. But they're very keen on shaking. They really want the shaking, or that's what I've heard from some people. Actually, someone else told me that's no longer the case. But it's hard to know exactly. I think the only real way that you can tell is whether you feel kind of more open or grounded or generally better afterwards. Really, that's, for me, that's the only kind of guaranteed way. And if you don't, and you habitually don't after a week or two, you probably won't bother with it anymore. That's just human nature.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, this is probably why I think I gravitated towards bioenergetics for that reason. One is immediate experience of it, but two, also it's sort of the lazy man's route to healing, right? Like, I've always found talk therapy is like going around the houses for about 15 years. And then, this is like, well, like, do this and it'll sort itself out. And you just kind of have to ride the storm, which is eventually you get used to that sort of unsettled feeling. I'm sure you're aware of that one. But what is this? What do you think this? I mean, it's in the title, so obviously biology, energy. What is this energy? Because it's a strange one.
Well, yeah. I mean, Reich had this concept of orgone, and you probably know as much about that as I do. Really, I haven't read tons of Reich's books on that topic, but
Hmm.
I guess the idea is there's a kind of energy in the body, and uh, maybe that cuts a little bit into like sort of Kundalini and the idea of the Hindu idea of energy, or there's other cult, Qi in kind of Chinese society, China and with the Jews and stuff. But like, in obviously in the Western tradition, you don't have that so much. Maybe in the kind of German Schopenhauer, Nietzsche kind of strain, perhaps. But bioenergy, I guess it is just this idea. I mean, if you look at people, you can kind of see like some have more energy than others. It seems fairly apparent. And it's more just to kind of try and make that into a concept in a sense. Within the tight framework of Western society, Western science, you're probably not going to get very far like that. But it kind of seems like there's an energy in the body, and that you can liberate it a bit, and but you can free it up. I guess the best term for it, I would say, is like libido, from like Freudian kind of. So not that I'm super read Freud, but this idea of a libidinal energy that kind of charges your system, and that you can kind of open it up and liberate it, or you can kind of shut it down and compress it.
Do you think it has like almost always has a direct relation to? I mean, obviously libidinal, but also one's sexuality. and not specifically in the sort of constrained idea of straight or gay, but one's sort of ability to be, you've used the word open, vulnerable, that form of sort of Reich sexuality of a playfulness with life.
Hmm. Well, that's obviously lovely to have, Um, how does it relate? I guess I think that openness is an intrinsic state, but we learn to kind of shut it down because of fear, or we just kind of go on a bit of an ego trip or something like that, rather than just being open to the moment, I think. If that relates to libidinal energy, but maybe it does. I'm not quite sure right off the top of my head, really. But I certainly think once people once you kind of experience a certain level of kind of openness and a kind of groundedness, which makes that feeling safe, life just feels better, really. It's not so much about material gains and acquisition. You might still do that kind of stuff, but it just like life just feels better. It feels more meaningful somewhere just to be alive and be present.
Mm. Mm.
How that quite relates to libidinal energy, I don't know. I mean, like Osho or other spiritual people will say, if you don't have energy, I think Osho famously said something like, if you don't have energy to be sexual, you won't have energy to be spiritual, you know? And like the Book of Revelation or something, this idea that energy can be pushed into kind of sexuality or the merchants of the earth and selling stuff and, the whore of Babylon, drunk on the blood of the saints, this kind of idea that you've taken spiritual energy and you've turned it into kind of just procreation, maybe something like that, not charged with too much Christian symbolism maybe, but like, there's a kind of there's a central kind of idea in, I think, Christian theology that energy can be moved in two directions, something like that.
It's interesting. I mean, it's a very interesting and unique way to talk about it, and I'm fairly in agreement with that. It almost seems that we have it would come across that we have an energy, and that as we've been talking about, at some point it's conditioned down, and down by the way in society. So you mentioned that often what you see is that people are low energy. I mean, as someone who's, I guess, practice so much and you notice certain patterns in people. What is it? Just, I'm very intrigued. What do you see sort of the most of when you're out in the world? Just low energy, or is there any common holding patterns that are just time and again they're there?
Well, I guess, you've got with the writing character structure thing, which I think Reich only created four, but there came five. The first three are kind of like, I mean, they're this kind of this idea of pre-egoic wounding, that the ego kind of develops around two, and that you've got this leading pattern or oral pattern or enduring pattern, all of which are kind of initiated at the initial stage of ego development or before. And these create certain characters. So oral type, it's super prevalent in today's world, I would say, it's meant to come, we don't really know of these things, from a lack of physical or emotional connection with the mother in the first year of life. And because our DNA kind of conditions us to expect a certain degree of connection with the mother, if that isn't met, then that sense of lack is kind of stored unconsciously in the body at the level of the belly. And then it creates a kind of a hole of inner neediness, which is not really consciously felt, but still operates a bit like a black hole inside the person, where often at certain times of the day, they just need stuff. They just need something to try and fill it, and such a person typically will be obsessing on connection. Connection is super important to them, connection with other people. And then in order and they'll be very afraid of confrontation, because confrontation could potentially lead to the loss of a connection. So they tend to please, they tend to think about who they need to be in upcoming social situations or whatever, and that kind of thing, a bit doormatish, that's for oral character type. Then you have leaving, which is seems to be some kind of nervous system mediated behavior. It was originally kind of called schizoid back in the day, where a person is mostly living in the abstract world of the mind, and that's basically where they're hanging out. But it's happening because the body is full of feelings and energy, and their nervous system just thinks that's a bit of a scary place and is for whatever reason keeping them out of there. Or that maybe they reside in their body a fair bit, but then when something triggers them a little bit, they're just straight out into this kind of abstract thinking world. And then enduring the kind of third of these kind of very debilitating pre-egoic structures is more like when we first start to kick off as a kid, like aged, I don't know, 2, and you start to, when you first forge your own sense of selfhood, of psychological selfhood, that's usually done with the word no, no. Before mama's taking you to the shops and you're just going along, and then age 2, it's like, no, I don't want to go to the supermarket, mum. And then if the parents come down quite strong on a kid at that age, it seems like there's a kind of nervous system response where the child's brain thinks there's a danger of ostracism. It seems is something like this. And because in our earlier history as a primate, if you got ostracized by your family, you would die, basically. So it treats that, it's kind of encoded somehow to treat that as an extreme threat, and it just shuts down outgoing expression. So the person kind of grows up in this vain endure life. Life is something to be survived. It's not a conscious thing that they're doing, conscious strategy that they're making. It's just their nervous system has kind of come in age 2, and no one's ever told it to stop doing that, or it hasn't, it doesn't have a way to stop doing that. So the person is very afraid of the outgoing side of the personality, of confrontation, and they sort of grumble and complain along and whatever, but they don't really want to confront themselves to create change, So those 3 character types, probably the enduring's a little bit less these days. I'd say oral's very high, and particularly with so much tech, and I mean, people who leave are very high. I get regular stream of clients who are basically either oral or leaving, that's because they're the kind of people that come for therapy, basically, as a general rule. The rigids are probably a bit more successful in life. Sometimes people from aggressive, sociopathic, more background, maybe under certain extreme circumstances might go for therapy, but probably not. But the other Reichian character types, like say rigid or aggressive, they develop later in life. So you've got drive. The first 3 kind of debilitate your basic, libidinal drive, capacity just to go out into the world and get shit done, basically. They're just very debilitating. You're in this oral, or you're always spaced out, or you're just kind of enduring along. The rigids and the aggressives can go and get stuff done in the world, but they may find life is a bit suboptimal, or in the place of aggressives, they may get into addiction or crime or something like that, and then eventually seek therapy. But generally, people who come from therapy are mostly these days, they're quite strongly leaving, or they're quite strongly oral as a jet, but kind of guys I get.
Okay. So therapy then for the oral type sort of becomes the thing that they think is going to fill the void, kind of paradoxically. I mean, the oral type in that sense seems to be, adjacent to our sort of consumerist eternal lack, right? Just constantly needing something to fill the void. So these other 2, the rigid and the aggressive, what kind of ages do they tend to appear?
Well, something just to mention here is like, also before I just answer your question, is like with character structure in general, I think, my take is a little bit different from a traditional take, in that it was always, when I first learned it and did some character structure tests, you had a kind of dominant pattern and a subsidiary pattern. And these days, I think it's more that we have all 5 to varying degrees. That's how I see it. And secondarily, I mean, in the early days, it was all about the body as well. There was the classic oral with the craning forward head, or the classic schizoid, tall and angular, the classic endurer, short, bull-necked. But really, I don't really see it like that anymore. So just to mention that to start with, it seems to be more in the mind and the behavior and the body type. But the rigid, I think, it's more someone who's learned to function well. Their parents perhaps told them that the important thing in life was to function, and to get things done. They've often were conditioned with, like, they were good behaviors, and there were bad behaviors. And if you did the good behavior, you got a reward or a treat. If you did the bad behavior, you got a punishment, and they kind of were okay with that in some way, or they became okay with it. They learned the rules of the game. So your classic rigid does not have a lot of, they will have some level of awe maybe, or leaving, but they came through past the age of say 4. Okay. So they've kind of like, they're quite successful. They've got drive. They can get into management roles quite easily, and they'll play the rules of the game. They will also test other people coming up. It's a lot about status when you're in this rigid thing, so if you're a male rigid, new man enters the department, you're going to test them. Can they take a few kind of, digs? Will they, can they, when the company's everyone's got to work through the weekend, will they commit? Will they go through it? That kind of thing. The rigid and rigid females are very, very status orientated. They're very status orientated. Men need to be challenged and tested before any kind of sexual access will be granted. It's very much about status, seductivity, and where your position is in the great hierarchy of things, and how are you going to make it up to the next level, and particularly ensure you don't drop down a level. So that's your kind of classic rigid. In many cultures, they're the backbone of the culture in many ways. They're the guys who kind of hold the whole culture up and maintain standards. Aggressive is like, it's less understood, I think, as a psychological thing. It probably wasn't one of Reich's original concepts. There's some story on the scene, which I never really managed to corroborate, that some student of Reich's created it as a label for Reich himself, which is a big meme, but I don't know if that's true or not, or whether he would really fit in that character. I don't know. But essentially, they're more someone they trusted. They really, really trusted when they were young, and someone let them down. And they kind of decided, I'm never going to trust anyone again. I'm going to become super self-reliant. I'm going to really focus on getting out there and just being successful and powerful. They're terrified of feeling vulnerability, basically. They're terrified of vulnerability. It's also sometimes known, it's a complex and emotive term, psychopath, because it's complex, or sociopath. Often very motivated, can be very successful, can be quite fluid, chameleon-like, can change and adapt very, very easily, unlike the rigid, which is just sort of straight up there. They just can't really connect with other people. There's quite a lot of rock stars who can be just amazing at the front, or back in the old days, when 90s more, amazing at the front of a band, just, kind of almost like be a lightning rod for people's energy completely for a stadium, 50,000 people. But if it came to them just sitting down and like just being vulnerable or just talking with someone, it would be immensely challenging for them. They just wouldn't do that, So that's more the kind of aggressive character type, something like that. It's usually thought to be a reaction to this loss of trust early on in life.
So how do you, as a sort of teacher of this now, how do you use these? You do, I know on your site there is like a test that someone can do to see their sort of relative percentages of what they may or may not be, like in relation to these. Do you sort of often use that as a foundation to see what might need, what exercises, what segments might need working with more than others?
Yeah, basically, yes, I do. I asked them to do my test. Most people, obviously, if they're coming for therapy and paying money for it, then they're quite happy to do that. And then, I use it as a diagnostic tool. It's not perfect, but it gives a kind of rough idea of what's going on inside. And obviously you discuss with the client if they think it's, a reasonable diagnosis and stuff. But I would use that. And just the idea of it on its own is kind of useful, because, you do this test and it comes up oral or something. You're like, what the fuck, and like, then you read about it and it's like, it's hammering into your brain, it's like, and then you're kind of going through, oh my God, my last relationship, was I like that or whatever, it's like, so, and oh my God, how I behave with my mother or at work or whatever, just reading about these things is kind of handy. Like most of these psychological tests, whatever they are, they're kind of they give you some quite direct feedback about your personality, which you may or may not like, but if you're open to it, could probably be quite useful to for you to introspect on who you are and how you behave in society. So that part is useful. And then typically, you've got certain kinds of body work or psychological strategies for each of these character types. Like the oral, needs to find a way to approach anger. Orals are very afraid of anger. They're very afraid of confrontation because, as far as they're concerned, what they've learned is it might block connection.
Hmm.
And that's what's terrifying for them. And orals will come for therapy because they kind of like the idea of therapy anyway, but also they get bored of being pleasers, or they've just been dumped on one too many times, and it's like I need to deal with this now.
So what do the I mean, to give an example for the oral type that is kind of needy and constantly requiring something, but also doesn't want to upset people, what do the exercises kind of look like for that? Obviously, they would
Well,
differ from person to person, but
yeah. I mean, the oral is a lot about getting some energy in the belly. So sometimes I would go in with like doing a thing called the intense belly breathing workout, which I developed a couple of years back. And that just really works on the gut, on the belly, in physically getting the abdominals moving, and combined with deep breathing and with a couple of different techniques so you don't get in a rut with it. So that's like a very strong medicine. Generally, my approach is a bit like a traditional old school physician. I give people workouts rather like medicines, and then you come back later and you say, is the medicine working? Was it need changing? Or is it too strong? Or is it not strong enough? That kind of thing. So I'd give them a daily workout, a weekly workout, maybe of this intense breath work,
mm,
and then a daily workout based around maybe the bow and arch, which are like foundational postures, with something like maybe right to exist exercise, where you have to really thrust your pelvis forwards with aggression, and look angry like an animal and that kind of thing. And you have to do that daily for a certain, 15 minutes or something like that. And, then you meet back a couple of weeks later online and you just discuss how it's going and what the clients noticed in the meantime. Has their relationship with at work, or I mean, typically there's three scenarios for the average human. You've got love life, friendships, and work, and you just see how they're kind of doing in those fields, if they were particularly, because sometimes people are different. They may be very oral in a relationship, but quite rigid and dominant at work. It often happens. It's like there can be variety. So you just meet back and you see how it's going, really.
mhm.
Or sometimes, if it's really stirring a lot up, there's a lot of discussion in between sessions as well, messaging and stuff.
Mm. So you strike me as someone who's very you really aren't dogmatic about this stuff, and I mean that in a kind way, because Reich, as much as I love Wilhelm Reich, there is an air of clinical. We're going to keep it within the bounds of this quite one materialist, but also not. He doesn't. He just wants to stay within the bounds of what he's created in this system, and then equally with Lowen as a sort of offshoot of that, it seems sometimes a bit dampened down. Right for me, but there's good stuff in Lowen, obviously. But equally, you include rebirthing, as you said, you developed your own system, and the one of the breathworks that I can't remember his name, Jeddah, but you include a lot of other bodywork things that are also adjacent to sort of spiritual practices within your own, say, let's say, bioenergetic school. So what is it you sort of, I mean, maybe you can dip onto a few of these other practices, but why is it that you've sort of expanded out in this way?
Well, I mean, like we were saying just before you began recording, I didn't come from like a kind of, okay, I'm going to be a therapist. Let's go to the Reich school, or let's go to the Lowen school. So really, a lot of the therapists who are really working in this scene, in my experience, they come from one of two quite underground sources. They don't actually, because Reich one and Lowen also to a large degree did not really write much about their actual techniques. Reich wrote virtually nothing, and it was actually an injunction, as far as I understand, to write about the techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And then Lowen made one book for the Joy of Vibrant Living or something like that, which has got techniques in it, but not tons of kind of deep stuff, but it's got stuff in there. So not much was transmitted down the kind of written line to come through. And likewise, therapists had injunctions about giving away techniques and stuff like that. And the scene probably wasn't that big. Really, the kind of scene that I came out of, and the therapists who've really kind of been in the group room a lot, logging a lot of hours in the group room, not so much reading books, but just in the group room with people, working with them, either came out of the American drug treatment scene from the late 50s, 60s, 70s, centers like Synanon, Chuck Diederich, Daytop, Dan Casrael, or Phoenix House, Frank Natali. Those are founder guys. Those were America decided in the post-war period that drug addiction was a big issue, and they wanted to try and start rehab centers. And these rehab centers became basically places where therapists could just experiment with junkies, with addicts, essentially. Most of the therapists actually were former addicts who'd been through the program of the house they were in, and then they went on to work with addicts. And because addiction is classically quite hard to work with, the average 28-year-old heroin user with a history of crime, probably not that easy for them to open up and be honest. It was generally felt like you could do pretty much anything with these guys. So they became, and there were about 2,000 of these centers, I think sometime in the 70s in America. So they became an environment where therapists would come together, and just the most extreme therapy that you knew, you could just try it. Encounter therapy was the backbone, which is like where in a group of people, you start to give out your judgments about each other, and they give their judgments to you, and then you have to be with and work with that material, either with emotion expression or whatever. Stuff from Reich or Lowen would have been included in that stuff, body work, dance stuff, primal work, going into the bay, a lot of emotional expression, screaming and shouting, anything like that was kind of put into that mix. The therapists sort of running those centers, they were working with very out there, kind of very strong confrontational therapeutic processes. So that environment, particularly in the 70s, was a melting pot for all of these kind of different body-based approaches. And then maybe a decade down the line, 70s and 80s, Osho, the Bhagwan, Sri Rajneesh, controversial character and basically a kind of cult leader, essentially, in Pune, India, a little bit north of Mumbai, south of Mumbai. He had a big ashram in the 70s, and that became like a super cool place for kind of, therapist hippie types in Europe and America. And they kind of all went to see the Bhagwan, so even guys working in these drug treatment centers and stuff like that would go and visit the Bhagwan. A lot of them did, and the Bhagwan was kind of like, he did talk a little bit about Reich and stuff like that, but his basic thing was like, you guys, you need to clear up your stuff and become enlightened. That's what you're here in this ashram for. I know you're all trying to get off with each other, and that's half the reason you've come, but actually you're supposed to be clearing up your stuff and getting enlightened. So to be kind of a member of a cool gang around the Bhagwan, this is like, 20, 30,000 people, you had to do groups. You had to get in the group room and do groups. And again, it was the most extreme therapeutic approaches that you could find. Free-form encounter groups of all sorts of mad shit going on. 5 days in this underground chamber they had and stuff like that. So, if you wanted to be part of the background scene for a long time, you had to do a lot of groups. It wasn't that Osho was kind of describing the groups. He had some probably vague knowledge of them, but it was just a massive melting pot of intense therapies. And because it was based in India, though, for about 5 years, it was based in Oregon, in America, which didn't go so well. But because it was based in India and coming out of that, a lot of meditation stuff came in as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you had a whole variety of different things all thrown into this big melting pot hodgepodge. And, that's where I came out of. I didn't know the Bhagwan myself. I'm a bit not that old, but I started to do those groups around 2000, like I said. So, it was a whole hodgepodge of all these kind of different Western therapies mixed up with all sorts of Tantra stuff from East or West, mixed up with all sorts of meditation or breathwork stuff. It was just a melting pot of all these different things. And a lot of therapists kind of disconnected at some point from the Bhagwan or got bored, dropped their sannyas name, like Devaraj is a sannyas name, my real name is Nick, but and went back to just being a therapist or something. And, that had an immense effect on Western therapy. Actually, it really did, but it's not really recognized as such. Where it probably didn't work so well was like, still people wouldn't write stuff down.
Hmm.
If you were a good therapist, it was a very kind of status environment, and quite a male dominated environment. You had your techniques and you're running your 3-day groups, you've got your promotional people doing stuff, and you didn't really, unless people were going to pay you $10,000, $20,000 for a training, you didn't really write your techniques down and put it in open source. And like Reich or Lowen, you would say as a justification was that this stuff's too intense. It's like rocket fuel. You have to be trained to administer it. You can't just put it into make it open source. And so, at some point, a lot of these techniques about 5-10 years ago, it was almost a point where they were just going to drop off the kind of map of knowledge or whatever you would call it, where literally there's no written record of a lot of this stuff. And there's no people left who are teaching it because they passed on or got old or softened up a lot. You kind of hit a point where, if someone doesn't start writing this stuff down soon, it's just going to be lost for the next generation.
Yeah.
I'm kind of coming out a bit there, but of your original question, I don't know if I really.
No. You got that. I mean, it's good because then you both kept your sannyasin name and you've written it all down in multiple books.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny that you say that, one of the reasons they didn't write it down was this idea that's like, it's too powerful for people or whatever. And the one book we have with Reich is Jack Willis's Reichian
Yes.
Therapy for Home Use, which is I think it's a great book, but his constant repetitions of go slow, warning on every page. But it is very potent stuff. So I mean, it might be one thing, just I guess off the back of the Osho, is also because one of your more recent books is about bioenergetics and alchemy, which is a sort of a workbook as well. So I guess it's a pretty big question, but how do you see bioenergetics and spirituality sort of interlocking in that sense?
Well, actually, it's not as complex a question as that for me personally. It's more like it's again going back to like libidinal energy or whatever, and I think with some of these, alchemical tarot, I'd actually studied Kabbalah. Like again, 1999, I just got into this kind of stuff along with Ibogaine and then therapy, and then I kind of dropped it a few years later. But I came back to it a few years ago when I just found I was doing some meditation. I just kept getting flooded by all these old kind of Rosicrucian concepts that I'd known from 20 years before. So I got back into it. But basically, it's just liberating the energy in your body, but the human body's got a lot of energy in it, but it's blocked up from repression and all of this. Liberating the energy and then channeling it into something, essentially, freeing it up and making it available to you, and so you can channel it into something. Whatever you're doing. So it kind of that's really how I see it. I mean, I guess also related to like some aspects of alchemy would be like towards either enlightenment or through, there's an aspect of it which is less known, possibly more known 400 or 500 years ago, Thomas Vaughan and stuff, where really it's just about sunlight. It's actually about getting your body to process sunlight. This is like sounds very weird and like highly dubious.
Looks like I'm about to go down another rabbit hole. Is this Thomas Vaughan?
Thomas Vaughan was one of the guys, I think 1700s or something, like early Rosicrucian times. The idea that, the basic idea kind of is that a lot of food contains the level of light within it, but it just kind of passes out of your body. But if you can make some subtle changes to bits of how your gut functions, then the light can move into your bloodstream via the lacteals. I think this is the theory. And then it goes in the bloodstream and it kind of has a swirling motion in the bloodstream. This is in both Jewish and Hermetic Kabbalah. This is kind of a background theme of swirling through the blood. And then it kind of creates some kind of changes to your pineal gland, which give you kind of access to superconscious states, or arguably make it so that your body can basically resist death, or you can kind of move into some kind of another layer and get another body, solar body, this kind of thing. Book of Revelation is kind of,
Mm.
some people could interpret it in a similar way, and this kind of ancient Greek mysticism, ancient Jewish mysticism, this kind of thing relating to light, relating to this kind of thing. And then you've also got ideas of Kundalini and Kundalini awakening and that kind of stuff. I mean,
Yeah, I guess that's a question. I mean, do you think that when one is dealing with, because to define the energy in the body, I mean, I asked you about it earlier. It's a sort of impossible question because it's what exactly is it, right? But it is, when you're working with these things, it almost does pay to have a knowledge of these other systems, because Kundalini is a key example of, when you're playing around with these things, it's a pretty dangerous. Kundalini specifically, it's kind of like, if you don't know what's happening there, you can fire it off into the wrong part of your body and do a bit of damage. So do you think it pays to have knowledge of various systems to really see what's going on? I think, to be honest, I think this is one place Reich drops off for me, is he kind of just draws a line at scientific materialism, and you feel like, well, what about if you start getting different experiences from this that are spiritual, for instance?
well, that's certainly, I mean, certainly what, I lived nearly 20 years in an Osho community in Dorset in the UK, and you get a lot of people coming who've obviously had some kind of Kundalini experience, whether it's a classic kind of awakening, explosion of light in the head sort of thing, or just, they suddenly become struck by tremors a great deal or something like this. Something has happened, and the classic interpretation from the Hindus, or kind of that old Arthur Avalon book, The Serpent Power, where the Kundalini is coiled up in the base chakra, around the perineum. And then at some point it can awaken and travel up through the other chakras, up to the crown. That's the basic sort of model. And it certainly does seem that there are people in the psychiatric system, who basically have had some kind of Kundalini experience. And because that's not really recognized by, they've gone a bit off the rails and gone a bit nuts, So I think one of the things to understand about Kundalini, in a sense, it's not useful to put it in a spiritual context, because what sometimes happens is that people get very into this idea that they're now a spiritual being because they've had some kind of Kundalini awakening. They hang out with other people who've kind of had a bit this kind of thing, when really what you need, if you have had some kind of awakening experience, really, in order to kind of ground it, or to make it proceed more, you probably need to do just more personal psychological work, or this kind of bioenergetic stuff, because it's easy to make everything very spiritual and abstract. If there's a lot of energy in your head, there's a tendency to do this, but really you need to come back and look at the wounded side of yourself, and the personality, and the childhood stuff that was going on, and all of this kind of thing, and do much more personal therapeutic work. So, I mean, in a sense, I think it's useful to know that there may be something we call Kundalini, but it could get activated, and that, if you have that experience and you don't want to kind of do more personal psychology, you may run into trouble at some point, and you may just go a bit nuts. Psychosis essentially, the way I see it, or the kind of body-based perspective on psychosis, is that you go into an abstract world and you can't really get back down again. It's like, ideally you can go, like going up into the attic to escape a tiger in the basement, but ideally you can come back down when the tiger's not scary anymore, and if you can go into this ideational world where you're referring to the guy down the shops and you just see him as the king of Sweden or whatever, but you can do that. But if you can't come back down from that, that's psychosis, basically. I don't know if you've been around people who've had psychotic episodes, there's quite a lot in the spiritual scene. But that is something that can happen from, having a Kundalini experience, because you're not really self-aware on a kind of personal level about what's going on with me in my childhood and all of this kind of thing. You go off into this spiritual world and you can't easily get back down again, and you start to go off the rails. And some people probably could come back down, but to come back down would be more like, now you have to face the wounds, now you have to be vulnerable, now you have to talk about your anger, and it's just on an ego level, it's preferable to sort of stay in a spiritual fantasy world, And then for someone like that, if they lose it a bit, they could go into psychosis, in the meditation scene. If you were to go to like one of these classic 10-day, 10 hours a day meditation retreats like at the Dharma Depot or whatever, those guys will all know about psychotic episodes for sure because they get them all the time, in people going to do the retreat, and they know how to kind of watch out for it and treat it. It's like, I guess to answer your question rather in a rather long-handed manner, it's like, it's good to understand that this could happen, Kundalini stuff, and that the way through with it is to focus on the personal side, on you, who you are as a psychological being, and that kind of thing.
Is this sort of what your recent alchemy book is trying to achieve? A sort of a workbook that has that equilibrium, that's bioenergetics and we could say self work as well.
Well, a bit, I guess. I don't frame it in that context, but what I kind of get disappointed with in the general esoteric scene is that it kind of appeals to people who are often a bit wounded, and they want to kind of make themselves special as a kind of magician, esoteric person or something like that, as a mechanism to cover over some of the sort of early woundings. If you go to Glastonbury, you meet a lot of guys like this, and like or women. And so, but I think more in my books about alchemy, that it's more like, really what this is about is energy in the body. When you look at these kind of, say you're doing Abramelin ritual, which I think is based on Sartora from Jewish things and whatever, or some modern day version of it, headless ritual, what in a sense you're kind of trying to do is evoke almost the pre-cognitive, pre-thinking aspect of your being and get energy to move, even in with a lot of visualization exercises from Kabbalah, with a lot of ritual work, group ritual work. I would say a big chunk of what it's really trying to achieve is to get some of the blocks out of the system, get the energy flowing. That's what it's trying to do. But what we can now do is just do that with bioenergetics. We can also use bioenergetics for that. So really, that's the kind of subtext of my two books on that. It's like, we tend to think, okay, esoteric stuff is over here and body-based therapy is over here, but they could also be that they're kind of trying to do the same thing, I would say. Obviously some people from particularly the esoteric field would say that's bollocks basically, and it's not. But like, that would, my contention is the intention of the people who set up these Rosicrucian schools or Jewish schools or whatever, it's more to try and get energy moving in the body so that it can be used for spiritual purposes.
Well, I'm in complete agreement with you, which is why I think my interest in bioenergetics and bodywork increases, is because so much spiritual stuff is really to do with getting out of your own way, and if you've got and being able to have space to let something in and commune, if you want to use that word, and if you've got all these blockages, nothing can come in. Your ego is just all these different blockages. So I'm completely with you that it's the same thing, but one side, the spiritual side, loves their own little language, I think.
Well, I guess there's often a Y junction in the road somewhere. Maybe you've had a spiritual experience and you could, like, I think people do go through this, and I think I've been through it, and it's like, you could either take one road, which is like, okay, now I'm going to be real and I feel vulnerable about talking about my dad and this, that. And the other one is like, now I need to work on my second chakra. Now I need to keep going in the abstract path and trying to kind of like create a spiritual ego to kind of like wallpaper over the wounded person underneath or something like that. I see that happening. And then of course, you're on that. It's not only new and exciting, but you've got a bit of status in the esoteric group that you're attached to, whatever it is, whether it's Crowley or Mork or something. And then it's like, you're not to say anything bad about any of those guys. It's like at some point, do you want to keep going deeper? It's like a gambler at the table, and you've got quite a good hand that you've developed.
Yeah.
Whatever, you've got quite a few chips. Are you going to put them all back in again and maybe lose them all and maybe go much deeper? Or are you just going to carry on with your usual betting strategy? It's like, that's the kind of question. I was reading something recently just about a bit not totally related, about accelerationism, where it said it's like God kind of God at the casino deciding to bet the house or something like this. It's like, or a person at the casino deciding to bet the house, humanity deciding to just, okay, let's bet the whole community, the casino, and I don't mean to go off into a different topic or something, but it's like, I think you as you get older, 30s, 40s, 50s, and you're in one of these scenes, it's like, do I keep going deeper within myself and take risks, or do I just kind of chug along, as the
Well, I mean, the acceleration is
gravy train, the spiritual gravy train, or therapy gravy train.
yes. Well, I know I'm with you. I mean, this the accelerationist idea is kind of key. It's funny that one of the places early on when I was looking at that stuff, where the famous sort of almost accelerationist quote, "The only way out is through," in Stephen Höhler's book about Jung and the Seven Sermons of the Dead. He described Jung's whole practice as exactly that. The only way out of this is through. And as you're saying, when you're constructing this other spiritual ego, you're just kind of idling along, creating this other thing, and you're not risking that. Like, right, we need to basically break this. We need to go through. You got to go through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess just near the end here, I mean, I will say it. So I'll ask where you think people should begin, but I will say begin with your own book.
Let me just very quickly
Okay, sure.
because there's some Turkish air exercise going on outside, and I don't know.
No worries.
Sorry, I don't know if Zoom. I know it's very good at.
No. I couldn't hear anything.
Oh, couldn't you? Okay.
Well, and I was just gonna say, where people should start. So I will say, part one of your own book, Bioenergetics. This is the Healing Trauma and Conditioning series, and then also like for breathwork, your own book, the Reiki and breathwork. But and also your own website as well and your YouTube channel has astounding amount of content. But where would you advise people to begin there?
I think if people are kind of like interested and want to know, does this work for me or something, then maybe commit to doing like the bow and arch, just on a 1.5 or 2 minute dings, 3 reps, and 2 minutes just lying down at the end, and commit to doing that every day for like a month or something. You can find that on our YouTube channel, The Bow and the Arch. And just and if you commit to doing it every day or at least 6 days a week for a month, you'll probably know if this stuff is likely to work for you or not. It's like, and just because it's kind of, you have to do it. And I mean, the other thing that you often get with it is new people coming in is either they want it very compartmentalized, which my first book doesn't help. I'm going to rewrite that book next time, actually, because it's kind of based around parts of the body, which works to just list a lot of exercises, but it doesn't, it kind of over compartmentalizes things. So I want to rewrite, but like, they're either compartmentalized or they're always looking for like one magical trick that can just get through everything, and sometimes you do have breakthrough experiences, but I mean, often with this work, you just see it's a lot about discipline, unfortunately, which is a super draggy concept in some ways, but it's a lot about repetition, about habits. It's a lot about habits, like that famous American James Clear Atomic Habits book like 20 years ago or something. If you just integrate this into your daily workout or a bit of your daily life every day, even if it's only 20 minutes, and just see if it makes a difference, then it can really create a lot of change. But it kind of needs that. Workshops can be good to have a blast of energy and just really go deeper for a day or two. But otherwise, you kind of need that background discipline. For most people, that's what I see, and myself certainly included, just to keep things moving, like almost a maintenance dose. And then every now and again, go a bit deeper with something.
That seems like good advice. Or we could just jump in straight with a rebirthing.
Yeah, rebirthing is great. I mean, rebirthing is great because like all you do is just massively ventilate the body.
And you feel amazing.
Well,
but you might not. You might not.
Yeah.
You might not feel it, well. But you feel good. The reason I actually mentioned that one is I think it's one that puts you very in tune with what Reich would say about like streaming. So all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, I can actually feel all the energy in my body that's always there. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. No, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. I feel like I've been talking a lot and you've just been asking a few questions. It'll be, it's also, you're a guy who's probably got a lot of experience and knowledge as well,
No. It's all so what's your website? I just want to make sure that people know the Bioenergetics.
Yeah. Bioenergetics.org.uk is my website, and Devaraj Sandberg, you can find me on YouTube. There's an absurd amount of content, which is a bit chaotic, but some is in kind of playlists, which makes it a bit more accessible.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to put both the links for that and for your books in the description below. But it's been a great conversation, Devaraj. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James.